We always talk about the courage it takes to stay, but what about the quiet honesty required to finally walk away? Breaking a lifelong vow isn't a loud explosion. It is the heavy, necessary silence of realizing you are fighting for a ghost, a relationship that has already ended internally, even while it continues to occupy the same house, the same calendar, the same side of the bed. Choosing an empty hallway over a performative marriage is not failure. It is mercy. It is, in many cases, the most honest thing you have done in years. Because we have been taught, in ways so deep they feel like character rather than conditioning, that staying is virtue and leaving is surrender, that the length of a commitment is proof of its worth, that if you walk away from something you once promised to save, you have failed yourself, your partner, your family, the version of you who stood in a room and meant every word. This is about something different. This is about what happens when the promise you made to a past version of yourself has become a cage for the person you are now. The myth of the infinite fight. Every long marriage has its difficult seasons. The years of exhaustion, of distance, of two people moving through the same house like strangers who have memorized each other's schedules. And for most of those seasons, staying and working is the right call, the investment that eventually yields a deeper, more honest connection than what existed at the beginning. But there is a moment, and you usually know it when it arrives, when trying stops being a path towards something and becomes a performance in its own right. When the therapy sessions produce the same revelations and the same responses and the same temporary openings that close again within a week. When the conversation that was supposed to change things has been had 17 times, in 17 different forms, and nothing has shifted. When you are no longer working toward reconnection, you are maintaining the appearance of working, because the appearance feels more manageable than the alternative. This is the moment the honest question becomes, what exactly am I still fighting for? Not in anger, not in defeat, but with the clear eyes of someone who has finally allowed themselves to see what has actually been true for some time. Is there still a living relationship here that can be restored? Or has the relationship already ended, and what remains is a shared structure held together by habit, obligation, and the accumulated weight of a life built together? Recognizing that the relationship has reached its natural conclusion is not giving up. It is seeing clearly. And seeing clearly, after years of choosing not to, takes more courage than any argument. The weight of a broken vow. The guilt of leaving a marriage is unlike most other guilt. It does not arrive once and depart. It arrives in layers in the middle of ordinary moments, in the faces of people who will be affected, in the particular anguish of standing before a memory of yourself that was so certain, so full of intention, so genuinely committed to a different outcome. The vow matters. It is not a small thing to have made it, and it is not a small thing to break it. The woman who stands in front of you now and says it is time to go is not canceling the woman who stood in that room 30 years ago and meant every word. She is continuing her. She is the next chapter of someone who has been learning and changing and trying for decades, and who has arrived, honestly, at a place of knowing. Staying in a marriage out of obligation when the marriage has already ended is not honor. It is a different kind of dishonesty, one that costs both people something they cannot get back. The years you spend maintaining a performance of commitment are years neither of you spends moving towards something real. The kindest thing you can do for someone you once loved deeply, in many cases, is to stop performing for them. To tell the truth, to let the structure come apart so that something honest can begin for both of you separately, Releasing the burden of historical loyalty does not mean the history meant nothing. It means you are no longer willing to let the weight of the past determine the shape of the future. That is not betrayal. That is maturity. The architecture of an empty hallway. There is something that no one prepares you for when you finally make the decision to leave. The specific quality of the silence that follows. Not the chaos, the silence. The moment when the house is yours alone, when the tension that had become so ambient you stopped registering it is simply gone. When you move through rooms without negotiating, without accounting for someone else's presence, without the low-grade vigilance that cohabitation with the wrong person eventually requires. Women who have made this choice describe the experience with a consistency that is striking. They did not expect the relief. They expected grief. And there is grief, real, complex, layered grief for what was lost and what was hoped for and what will never be. But alongside it, almost immediately, arrives something they had not anticipated. The physical sensation of having room to breathe. The empty hallway is not a symbol of failure. It is a space that has been cleared. And what is cleared has the potential to be filled not immediately, not quickly, but eventually with something that is actually true. A home that belongs to you. A morning that is entirely your own. A life organized around your actual preferences, rather than the accumulated compromises of a relationship that no longer fits. This is not nothing. This is, for many women, the beginning of the most honest chapter of their lives. Navigating the social aftermath. The world will have opinions about your departure, and they will often arrive before you have had time to establish your own. There will be people who need a reason, a catalyst, a dramatic inciting incident, something they can file under a familiar category. An affair, a crisis, a specific moment of rupture. When the answer is simply that the marriage ended slowly, quietly, over years, without a single explainable event, that the relationship simply reached its conclusion, many people find this unsatisfying. Unclear endings make them uncomfortable. They will try to supply the narrative they prefer. You do not owe anyone that narrative. The departure from a marriage that has reached its natural end does not require external validation to be legitimate. It does not need to be dramatic to be serious. The quiet decision to stop performing a commitment that is no longer honest is one of the most significant things a person can do, and it is private. It belongs to you and, to some degree, to the person you are leaving. It does not belong to the people at the dinner table who want to understand it in terms that make sense to them. Protecting your narrative means understanding that your reasons are sufficient even when they are difficult to explain. It means declining to be cross-examined about a decision that has already been made. It means allowing other people's discomfort with your choice to be theirs, carried by them, not absorbed back into you as evidence that you were wrong. The courage to act from an honest internal place in the face of a world that prefers you to stay in familiar discomfort is not something that requires anyone else's endorsement. The radical act of choosing peace. Here is what becomes possible on the other side of a departure that was honest. Not immediately, not in the first weeks, when the grief is present and the logistics are overwhelming and the future feels entirely uncharted. But in time, and this is the thing that women who have made this choice describe with a consistency that deserves to be heard, in time, something extraordinary happens. You begin to recognize yourself again. Not the self you were before the marriage, which is gone and would not fit anyway, but a self that has access to its own preferences, its own rhythms, its own voice, a self that is not in constant negotiation, a self that can sit with a decision and trust the feeling it produces rather than immediately moderating that feeling against what someone else might think or need or want. The heavy silence, the one that arrives when you finally stop performing, is not empty. It is full of information. It tells you, for the first time in years, what you actually think, what you actually want, what kind of a life you would choose if the choosing were entirely yours. Redefining success not as the longevity of a bond, but as the courage to leave when the bond is already broken. That is a shift that takes time to absorb because we have spent so long measuring worth in duration. The longer you stayed, the more serious you were. The longer you tried, the more committed you were. But a marriage that ends honestly after 30 years because two people have the courage to tell the truth is not a failure. It is the final act of a relationship that was, at its best, built on honesty. And the peace that follows the specific, earned, unhurried peace of a life that is finally your own is not consolation. It is the reward. It is what becomes available when you choose integrity over performance, truth over habit, the difficult honesty of the present over the comfortable lie of a future that was never coming. The commitment that matters now is the one you make to yourself. And that one, unlike the others, is entirely within your power to keep. If this names something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are not yet on this porch, subscribe. Because this is exactly the kind of truth we tell each other here. I am Patricia, and I will see you next week.